Cyrene has one of the most overloaded kits in the entire game, to the point where she has an entire separate UI in the game to list all of the different buffs she gives to all the different Chrysos heirs. However, more isn't always necessarily better. While I definitely think Cyrene is strong, I think she also has a lot of issues with her kit, just overall being messy. And while I expect Hoyo to fix up a lot of the messiness in her kit, I wanted to give my take on what I would like to see them change in Cyrene's kit in order to make it feel better to play with every Chrysos heir. And yes, I know her beta changes are right around the corner, but that's why I want to release this video, to compare my ideas on how to change her kit to what Hoyo actually decides to do, for fun. So, without further ado, let's dive into the problems in Cyrene's kit and how I, Chewy Bar, would like to see them fixed. First off, let me say right off the bat that they are not going to change the direction of making her tailor-made for the Chrysos heirs. While I would love to tone down the racism in Cyrene's kit, I don't realistically expect this to happen. And so I'm just going to accept the fact that her kit specifically names each and every Chrysos heir to give them a specific buff that only they can benefit from. Moving on from that, the first thing I want to see changed about Cyrene's kit is not going to surprise anyone: her ramp-up time. This is the number one thing that makes Cyrene feel awful to play, especially for low cycle clears. She spends the entire first cycle spamming her skill to try and get her ultimate, and she forces the rest of your team to accommodate her during the first cycle as well. Her ultimate is very powerful, no doubt, but the time it takes to reach her ultimate makes her a pain to play. And for many casuals, Cyrene is going to single-handedly cost them the entire first cycle because she just doesn't do anything until she gets her ultimate. There are multiple ways we could remedy this issue. Cyrene's own kit fixes it with her E2, which makes her start with 12 extra stacks for her ultimate, which is really more like starting the battle with 18 stacks, since she starts with 6 if you have 3 Chrysos heirs. However, I think this is actually too strong to add to her base kit without balancing things out a little bit. Obviously, Cyrene's ultimate is so strong because it can instantly activate the entire team's ultimates, but what makes her E2 so strong is the fact that you instantly get 2 casts of her ultimate, since it activates at 24 stacks, but only consumes 12 in order to activate it. This is very, very strong to give Cyrene at the start of the fight, essentially for free, which is what her E2 does. Instead, to balance Cyrene's ramp-up time in a way that makes it feel better, I would like to see a very simple change. Allow her to activate her first ultimate at 12 stacks. That's it. It only costs 12 stacks upon usage after all, so just let her use it at 12 stacks instead of requiring 24 stacks for the first usage. The reason this is balanced is because it gives Cyrene a much earlier ultimate, making her ramp-up time feel much better. However, if you want to get 2 uses of her buffing skill, you would still require 24 stacks total. Basically, as Cyrene is currently, she takes way longer to ramp up, but once she does ramp up, she can instantly buff 2 characters on the team. With my changes, Cyrene would ramp up much more quickly, meaning she would instantly fill the team's ultimates much more quickly too. But she would only buff 1 character on the team, since her rotation is happening faster. To balance this out even more, I would take her bonus ability that gives her 2/3/6 recollection stacks, depending on the amount of Chrysos heir teammates, and reduce it down to 1/2/3 recollection stacks. Reduce her reliance on Chrysos heir teammates by reducing the amount of stacks she needs to begin with, and make her gain less from having them on the team, even though it's still a positive to have them on the team. So previously, Cyrene in her best case scenario, with 3 Chrysos heirs, needed 18 stacks just to activate her ultimate, since she began the battle with 6. But the trade-off was that upon activation, she could use it twice. Now, with these changes, Cyrene in her worst case scenario as the solo Chrysos heir would only need 12 stacks, and 9 stacks in her best case scenario with 3 Chrysos heirs. So we essentially cut her ramp-up time in half, but she can only activate her ultimate once. And if she wants a second use of her ultimate like before, she'll still require the same amount of ramp-up time as before. This would be a major help to characters like Aglaea and Phainon, who just want her first ultimate earlier, and to a lesser degree, Mydei and Anaxa. Mydei and Anaxa don't really have an issue per se with Cyrene's ramp-up time, so long as she gets her ultimate before the first cycle ends, since she then immediately gives them both 2 extra turns, or 2 extra God Slayers if need be. But letting her spread those turns throughout the first cycle, rather than backloading all of it right at the end of the first cycle, will feel a lot smoother to play for most people. Then, for Aglaea and Phainon, the earlier activation of their ultimate is just obviously much better and eases the rotations, so that they don't need to do things like putting Phainon on basic attack duty to generate skill points to focus the entire first cycle around Cyrene's ramp-up time. For Hysilens, it would help a lot to make Cyrene less reliant on Chrysos heirs for her ramp-up time, since we still want Kafka on the team. And for the Remembrance characters, the earlier ultimate is nice, but Cyrene's ramp-up time wasn't the worst thing in the world for them anyway, so it's just a nice bonus. In addition to her ramp-up time, I want to address one of the other underwhelming things about Cyrene, her undertuned general buffs. Not the buffs for the Chrysos heirs, but the buffs in her kit outside of her ultimate. At a baseline, Cyrene gives 20% true damage, which is similar to 20% res pen if that helps you compare it to other buffs. It's not quite the same, but just as a way to help you compare it, as well as 40% damage bonus. Compare that to the likes of Ron May, who gives 68% damage bonus and 25% res pen, already beating out Cyrene in terms of pure damage amp, without even taking into account the speed and weakness break efficiency. Obviously, Cyrene has the specific Chrysos heir buffs from her ultimate, but I personally would prefer if Cyrene's kit took away some of the power from her Chrysos heir specific buff buffs to instead increase her general buffing. Do note that by buffing her generic buffing, that is still a buff to the Chrysos heirs too. It's just shifting where the power budget in her kit comes from. Really, all Cyrene needs is a buff to her numbers. Increase her generic buffing by 50%, so take her 20% true damage to 30% true damage, and buff her 40% damage bonus to 60% damage bonus. This puts her much more in line with Ron Mei without even taking into account her specific buffs for the Chrysos heirs yet. Speaking of her specific buffs for the Chrysos heirs, that's obviously what we're going to tackle next. Before Cyrene's kit was revealed, a lot of people expected her to be a premium version of Remembrance Trailblazer. However, Cyrene isn't really fulfilling that role due to her lack of Mem's action advance. My solution is to make her a premium Remembrance Trailblazer for Chrysos heirs specifically. In other words, attach an action advance to each of the Chrysos heir buffs, similarly to her buff for Anaxa, but for each of the Chrysos heirs. Of course, their buffs would be balanced around this inclusion of an action advance, and we'll discuss how the action advance impacts each of the Chrysos heir buffs. So let's go through them one by one, starting with RMC. RMC's buff honestly doesn't need to change that much, even with the inclusion of an action advance. People are hyping up DPS RMC a lot, and while it's a ton of fun, especially in AoE scenarios, my experience with it hasn't been anything too crazy outside of fights that are very favorable towards it. Oftentimes, RMC isn't even doing the majority of the team's damage, or at least not by a lot. So while it's definitely a buff to just add an action advance here to RMC, I don't think much needs to change about their buff since it's mainly focused on RMC and Cyrene's own damage. In teams with an actual DPS who isn't RMC, you're mainly going to be spamming Cyrene's buff on them instead of on RMC anyway. For Aglaea, this action advance helps her so much. It feels super awkward when Cyrene activates Aglaea's ultimate while Aglaea is outside of the cycle, meaning Aglaea needs to ult just to get back into the cycle. Oftentimes, it's not enough for Aglaea to clear in the first cycle. By including an action advance in Cyrene's kit, she can manually advance Aglaea into the cycle, let Aglaea get one more turn, and then Aglaea can use her ultimate to get a second turn that will help her first cycle clears feel a lot smoother. However, the energy portion of Cyrene's buff for Aglaea should be removed entirely. Remember, Cyrene's reliance on Chrysos heir teammates and her general ramp-up time was also removed, so it's a lot easier to keep Sunday on Aglaea's team, meaning Cyrene can safely lose this energy buff completely to balance out her buff for Aglaea. The numbers on her Aglaea buff could also be tuned down, since they are admittedly very large and should be balanced around the additional action advance that Aglaea now has, as well as Aglaea's teams now being more flexible. For Tribbie, an action advance mainly just leads to more energy via an extra basic attack or skill, but it also comes with its downsides since it can potentially make Tribbie lose some uptime on her ultimate zone. Either way, it doesn't affect Tribbie too much, especially since Cyrene is probably never using the first ultimate buff on Tribbie anyway. Next is Mydei. The action advance is quite relevant for Mydei since it translates to more charge and obviously an extra turn of damage. I think we can keep the instant Godslayer still, which obviously makes Mydei's buff very strong, but to be completely honest, characters like Mydei and Aglaea could use the stronger buff from Cyrene to keep up with some of the stronger Chrysos heirs anyway. Removing the 60% crit damage buff from the instant Godslayer should be a fair trade-off for giving Mydei an additional turn. Next up is Castorice. The 100% action advance is very strong for Castorice since it directly translates to more Nuba charges, and it also synergizes with the Castorice buff since Castorice's buff allows her to convert excess charge into more damage. So now Cyrene allows Castorice to instantly take another turn and gain excess charge to utilize the buff. I think the numbers on this buff could use some rebalancing to compensate. Cyrene is currently losing to E1 Tribbie for Castorice teams, and I don't think this would be enough to change that, but I honestly think that that's completely fine since Castorice is already the strongest DPS in the game by a large margin and absolutely does not need more help. Next is Anaxa, who is sort of the blueprint for the changes we're giving to Cyrene since we're basically just taking the action advance from this buff and giving it to all the Chrysos heirs. I honestly don't have much to change about Anaxa's buff. I flirted with the idea of making the extra bounces of his skill permanent while taking away some of the damage buff she's giving him, but the fact that Cyrene's buff for Anaxa is limited is part of what adds to the skill expression of playing these two together, and it makes it feel extra satisfying when you're able to line it up with Cerydra's double skill. For that reason, I honestly think I wouldn't touch Anaxa's buff too much. I would probably still nerf the skill damage and attack buff to compensate for the fact that Cyrene's generic true damage and damage percent buffs in her base kit got buff, but other than some numbers rebalancing, Anaxa's buff just feels really good. There's a reason I'm making the other buffs more similar to it. And just to briefly touch upon making each of the buffs more similar, I think some people might see this as taking away the novelty of each buff by making each of them into an action advance. Personally, I think it makes Cyrene's kit a lot less messy by streamlining all of the Chrysos heir buffs to have more similar mechanics, in this case, by attaching an action advance to each of them. And then the additional buffs on top of that is more specific to each of the heirs' kits, while being balanced around Cyrene's generic damage buffs becoming stronger and her ramp-up time becoming easier to manage, thus allowing more flexible teammate options. Hyacine is up next. Action advancing Hyacine doesn't do too much. It technically can lead to more stacks for Castorice, but you would probably just want to action advance Castorice anyway. Outside of Castorice teams, you would still want to advance the main DPS, so it doesn't change too much for Hyacine. Cyrene and Hyacine are already a match made in heaven, so it's risky to touch their synergy too much. For Cipher, an action advance definitely barely makes a difference. It technically makes way for main DPS Cipher if you feel like doing that, which is fun. The main thing that changed about Cyrene's synergy with Cipher is the fact that Cyrene Cyrene is a lot more usable in non-Chrysos Heir teams now, thanks to her ramp-up time being reduced and her generic buffing being slightly higher, which indirectly helps her synergy with Cipher, since Cipher mainly sees usage outside of Chrysos Heir teams to begin with. And then we have Phainon. There's one major change I want to make for Phainon, and that's the extra multiplier buff that she gives to Phainon, the additional fire damage. First off, we can get rid of the crit rate buff in exchange for the action advance. It's easier to slot Sunday on the team to keep his crit rate buff after all, now that Cyrene's ramp-up time is more manageable. Secondly, we can keep the gimmick where she lets Phainon permanently stay on his ultimate. This mechanic in and of itself isn't the issue, it's mostly that Cyrene wasn't offering enough outside of the permanent ult uptime to make it feel as strong as it might seem. We've solved that a little bit already by buffing Cyrene's generic baseline buffs, such as her true damage and damage percent numbers, and we've allowed Phainon teams to be more flexible by reducing Cyrene's ramp-up time. The last thing I want to change is how Cyrene gets rid of Phainon's mechanic of core flame stack generation. Currently, Phainon plus Cyrene teams center entirely around Cyrene, where you're catering towards her ramp-up time to activate Phainon's ultimate for him, thus ignoring core flame stacks. It feels bad that one of the main mechanics in Phainon's kit gets completely ignored in these teams. In order to remedy this, we're going to get rid of the flat multiplier buff that she's currently giving him via the additional fire damage, and instead, Phainon now gets a stacking amount of additional damage that scales with the amount of core flame stacks he had before Cyrene filled up his ultimate. This way, his core flame stacking mechanic actually still matters, since having more core flames directly converts to doing more damage, even if Cyrene is still the one activating his ultimate for him. This allows characters like Sunday and Cerydra's E1 to still be relevant, because core flame stacking is still going to be relevant for Phainon. This also gives you more incentive to use Phainon's skill, as opposed to currently in Phainon and Cyrene teams, where Phainon only uses his basic attack, since Cyrene completely erases his core flame stacking mechanic. Out of all my kit buffs, this one is my favorite way to fix how bad Cyrene's buff feels for Phainon. It also, of course, makes the added action advance in her buff actually relevant for Phainon, since it lets him use an additional skill to get more core flame stacks to increase the additional multiplier that she's giving him. If it needs to be balanced, we can make the additional damage multiplier only apply to his meteor if need be. Next up, we have Hysilens. Easing Cyrene's ramp-up time already helped Hysilens and Kafka teams a lot, as did the buff to Cyrene's general buffing. If I were to change anything about Hysilens' buff, I would probably cut the energy she gives in half, since she's now action advancing Hysilens, and you can time the action advance to let Hysilens go twice in a row for more energy, as well as doubling Hysilens' DOT procs that she gets from Cyrene's buff. Keeping the energy where it currently is would be a little bit ridiculous with the added action advance, so nerfing the energy would help a little bit, since Hysilens is basically making up for it via the energy she gets from getting an additional skill from being action advanced anyway, you know? Part of what currently holds Cyrene back in Hysilens teams is the ramp-up time though, and with the ramp-up time reduced, I think it would also be fair to cut back on some of the damage buffs she gives to Hysilens as well. For Cerydra, the action advance is interesting. Allowing Cerydra to immediately cast her skill for more stacks is nice, but the issue is that in Cerydra teams, you would often want to use Cyrene's buff and action advance on the DPS anyway. With that said, I don't think it's a bad thing that Cerydra's buff isn't as important to use, since it means you don't have to feel so bad missing out on it to instead use Cyrene's buff on Phainon or Anaxa. Cerydra's current buff of gaining 1 stack of military merit charge after the double skill is used is a type of buff that's only relevant in longer fights, and I think it's fine that Cerydra has a buff that you only consider using in certain scenarios, so I actually wouldn't change too much about Cerydra's buff, since I think Cerydra's synergy with Cyrene is already better now due to Cyrene buffing Cerydra's main pairings more. For Evernight, Cyrene is already a pretty big buff to her, despite her specific buff for Evernight not being the craziest thing in the world. Honestly, the action advance alone is enough to make these two super strong, since it allows Evernight to double stack her Memoria stacks before Evie's turn when timed correctly. The 48% damage bonus could even be tuned down to compensate for the added action advance. And then for Dan Heng Pimenta Terai, action advancing him isn't doing much, but obviously the more important part is her action advancing the Soul Dragon, which she already does. Mostly, her ability to now action advance Hyacine and Dan Heng PT allows for some emergency survivability in their teams if need be, which is nice. Her buff towards non-Chrysos heirs is obviously super underwhelming, but we already sort of increased her ability to support non-Chrysos heirs by buffing her general buffing abilities, as well as making her ramp-up time less punishing in the first cycle. I definitely don't want to give her an action advance for non-Chrysos heirs, since that runs the risk of infinite looping action advance shenanigans when paired with Branya and Sunday, since Sunday actually can action advance Cyrene, since Cyrene isn't Harmony Path. If anything, I'd like to take her sub DPS potential from her buff with RMC and move it onto her buff for non-Chrysos heirs, perhaps making it so that she automatically launches her offensive Memesprite skill at the same time when she buffs a non-Chrysos heir, basically letting her use both the buff and the attack from her Memesprite skill to make up for the fact that her buff for non-Chrysos heirs is much more underwhelming, as well as pushing Cyrene more in a sub DPS role in non-Chrysos heir teams, while she focuses more on being a pure damage buffer and support for the Chrysos heirs. Last but not least, while we reduce the ramp up time for her first ultimate, I actually think she now runs the risk of ramping up her subsequent Memesprite skills too quickly. The added action advance to her Memesprite skill is very strong, so to balance that out, we should remove her ability to cheese out too many of these action advances by removing the bonus ability that allows Memesprites to give her stacks for her ultimate with no limit. Give Memesprites the same limit that other characters have. have, where they can only give 1 stack for her ultimate before needing to wait for Cyrene to take action again. This bonus ability was previously balanced out by the fact that Cyrene's buffs for Castorice and Evernight didn't do anything after the first usage. Therefore, charging her ultimate faster in a mono remembrance team wasn't the craziest thing in the world, since it would mostly just be used to deal extra damage or to give Hyacine a bit of extra energy. However, now that Cyrene can action advance them every time she casts her Mem Sprite skill, they would need their ability to charge her ultimate faster than other teams to be significantly reduced and brought back into line with Cyrene's other teams. So, to summarize, the things I would change about Cyrene include buffing her generic buffing capabilities, such as increasing her true damage and damage percent buffs outside of her ultimate so that she feels slightly better as a general support, reducing her ramp up time by allowing her first ultimate to be activated at 12 stacks, while also reducing her reliance on Chrysos Air teammates since she no longer gains and no longer needs a bunch of stacks at the start of battle just for having Chrysos Airs on the team, adding an action advance onto her Mem Sprite skill for each Chrysos Air, making her mimic RMC a bit more, while rebalancing the buff she gives for each Chrysos Air around the action advance and tuning some of her specific numbers down, differentiating her role in non-Chrysos Air teams into more of a sub DPS, letting her use both her buffing Mem Sprite skill and her attacking Mem Sprite skill at the same time when she uses it on an ally who isn't a Chrysos Air, to balance out the fact that her buff for non-Chrysos Airs isn't great. All of this would make Cyrene feel a lot smoother to play, and it really benefits a lot of the Chrysos Airs who need even more help from Cyrene. If it runs the risk of making Cyrene too broken for certain Chrysos Airs, then I think it would be fair to rebalance their numbers even more to compensate for the fact that adding an action advance to each Chrysos Air is really strong. Albeit Cyrene can't exactly use this action advance every turn, since she still needs to stack up enough recollection stacks to use it, but the fact that she can activate it outside of her own turn does make it very strong. So I would be open to rebalancing her numbers even more for specific Chrysos Airs. But obviously, this is just how I would personally tackle some of the messiness in Cyrene's kit, while making her feel better for a lot of the Chrysos Airs, such as Aglaea and Phainon and Hysilens. Other buffs I could give to her would include making her Light Cone easier to proc, since there are several teams where she can't even make use of its full effect, or giving her more self-speed buffs in her kit to make it easier for her to reach 200 speed, since she really wants to reach 200 speed in order to take the returns in the first wave. Her Planet Ornament set is supposed to help with this, but the speed buff only activates once her Mem Sprite is on the field, which, to be fair, by reducing her ramp up time at the start of the battle, it solves this issue somewhat since she now gets this buff much earlier into the fight. So that should still help her speed requirements by a little bit, whereas in her current iteration, this speed buff from the Planet Ornament doesn't even take effect until after the first cycle, since it takes Cyrene so long to summon her Mem Sprite. So maybe her speed would be fine with the ramp up changes we gave her. Or, of course, you can always just run Cyrene on Von Whack, which is my current preference for her. Either way, these were my ideas on how I would like to see Cyrene buffed to streamline her buff for the Chrysos Airs in a way that makes her kit feel less messy and all over the place, offering an action advance to each of them in addition to a smaller buff that's specific to their mechanic, as well as making her general supporting capabilities a bit stronger. And, of course, most importantly, reducing her ramp up time, which I think we all expect them to change. And again, her V3 beta update is right around the corner, which is why I'm releasing this video when I am, so that I can compare my ideas to the actual changes she ends up going through, just for fun and for the sake of discussion. But what did you think about my proposed changes to Cyrene's kit? And do you have any changes of your own that you'd like to see for her? Tell me in the comments below, and let's discuss what we want to see from Cyrene's upcoming beta changes. Like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. There will be plenty more content like this on the way, especially covering everything about Cyrene's beta, so subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss out on the discussion. Thank you so much for watching, and let us all wait with bated breath to see how Cyrene turns out in the future. Until next time!